Have you ever watched someone close their eyes and cover their ears when bad news comes on television, as if refusing to see or hear it could somehow make the terrible reality disappear? This peculiar human behavior reveals something profound about how some people navigate the messy, complicated world of relationships and emotions. The Ostrich Effect explains why certain individuals, particularly those with avoidant attachment styles, develop an almost supernatural ability to pretend problems simply don't exist, burying their heads in the sand while their relationships crumble around them. Picture this scenario. A couple sits in stony silence after a heated argument about trust and communication. One partner desperately wants to talk through what happened, to understand and repair the damage. The other partner picks up their phone, scrolls through social media, and acts as though nothing occurred at all. When pressed to discuss the issue, they might say something like, "What problem? Everything's fine." This isn't mere stubbornness or cruelty, though it certainly feels that way to the person being dismissed. This represents a deeply ingrained psychological defense mechanism that serves a very specific purpose in the avoidant person's emotional survival system. The human brain possesses remarkable abilities to protect itself from perceived threats, and for someone with an avoidant attachment style, emotional intimacy and vulnerability represent some of the most dangerous territories imaginable. These individuals learned early in life that depending on others for emotional support often led to disappointment, rejection, or even emotional harm. Their young minds, brilliant in their adaptability, developed a foolproof strategy. If emotional problems don't exist, then emotional pain cannot follow. But here's what makes this pattern so fascinating and heartbreaking. The very mechanism designed to protect them from hurt ends up creating the exact outcomes they fear most. Understanding this psychological phenomenon requires examining several cognitive biases that work together like a perfectly orchestrated symphony of self-protection. The confirmation bias leads avoidant individuals to notice only information that supports their belief that relationships are ultimately unreliable or unnecessary. The availability heuristic causes them to recall instances when emotional vulnerability led to pain more readily than times when openness created deeper connection. Meanwhile, the fundamental attribution error allows them to blame relationship problems on their partner's character flaws rather than examining their own contribution to the dynamic. What makes the ostrich effect particularly challenging to address is how well it works in the short term. When someone refuses to acknowledge relationship problems, they experience immediate relief from anxiety and emotional discomfort. This creates a powerful reinforcement cycle that strengthens the behavior over time. The avoidant person feels safe and in control, completely unaware that their partner feels increasingly isolated, frustrated, and disconnected. The tragic irony is that the very strategy meant to preserve the relationship often becomes the force that destroys it. But this truth remains hidden from the person employing the defense. But there's hope in understanding these patterns, because awareness creates the possibility for change. Throughout this exploration, several stories will illustrate how the ostrich effect manifests in real relationships, followed by practical strategies for recognizing and addressing this behavior, whether it's showing up in someone else or perhaps uncomfortably familiar in personal patterns. The goal isn't to shame or blame anyone for these deeply human responses to fear and vulnerability, but rather to shed light on unconscious patterns so that more conscious choices become possible. If you want to better understand someone's attachment style, see the link in the description to one of the most popular books on attachment theory. Now, let's delve into a story that perfectly captures how this psychological phenomenon unfolds in real life, because sometimes the most complex human behaviors become crystal clear when witnessed through the lens of lived experience. Consider the tale of a young woman named Rebecca who found herself in a relationship that seemed perfect on the surface but felt increasingly hollow beneath. Rebecca had been dating Marcus for nearly 2 years, and to outside observers they appeared to be the ideal couple. They attended social gatherings together, shared similar interests, and rarely argued in public. However, behind closed doors, Rebecca felt as though she was living with a charming stranger who had mastered the art of emotional disappearing acts. The first major incident occurred when Rebecca's father was diagnosed with a serious illness. She came home from the hospital, tears streaming down her face, desperate for comfort and support from the person she loved most. Marcus looked up from his laptop, acknowledged her distress with a brief, "Oh, that's tough," and then immediately launched into a detailed explanation of a work project that was consuming his attention. When Rebecca expressed hurt that he seemed more interested in his spreadsheets than her family crisis, Marcus appeared genuinely confused. "But you're handling it fine," he said, as if her tears and obvious distress were invisible to him. This pattern repeated itself in increasingly painful ways. When Rebecca tried to discuss feeling disconnected in their relationship, Marcus would suddenly remember urgent errands that required his immediate attention. When she brought up the possibility of moving in together, he would steer the conversation toward neutral topics like weekend plans or restaurant recommendations. Most tellingly, when Rebecca finally worked up the courage to say she loved him, Marcus smiled, kissed her forehead, and said, "You're amazing," before turning on the television. But here's where the story takes an interesting turn, because Rebecca began to notice something peculiar about Marcus's behavior. Despite his apparent indifference to emotional conversations, he would do thoughtful things that suggested he was paying much closer attention than he let on. After her difficult hospital visit, she found her favorite comfort food waiting in the refrigerator, purchased during one of his mysterious urgent errands. When she mentioned feeling stressed about work, he would quietly handle household tasks she normally managed. His actions spoke a language of care and attention that his words seemed incapable of expressing. The breakthrough came during what initially appeared to be their relationship's ending. Rebecca had reached her limit with the emotional distance and decided to have one final conversation about their future. She expected Marcus to respond with his usual deflection tactics, perhaps suggesting they grab dinner instead of talking about feelings. Instead, something unexpected happened. Marcus sat in silence for what felt like hours, his usual confident demeanor replaced by something that looked almost like terror. "Every time someone has mattered to me," he finally said, his voice barely audible, "they've left. My parents divorced when I promised myself their fighting didn't bother me. My best friend in college stopped talking to me after I couldn't handle his depression. The last woman I dated said loving me was like loving a brick wall." He looked up at Rebecca with an expression she had never seen before. "If I pretend problems don't exist, maybe they actually won't. Maybe you won't leave if there's nothing wrong to leave over." This revelation didn't magically solve their relationship challenges, but it provided a crucial piece of the puzzle that had been missing. Marcus wasn't indifferent to Rebecca's emotions or their relationship problems. He was terrified of them. His brain had learned to interpret emotional discussions as precursors to abandonment, so it developed an elaborate system to avoid acknowledging anything that might threaten the relationship's stability. The Ostrich Effect wasn't protecting him from relationship problems, it was protecting him from the anxiety of facing relationship problems. What happened next in their story illustrates both the potential for growth and the realistic challenges that come with addressing deeply ingrained patterns. Marcus agreed to work on recognizing when he was employing avoidance strategies, but change didn't happen overnight. There were setbacks and frustrations, moments when old patterns reasserted themselves with surprising strength. However, there were also breakthrough moments when Marcus managed to stay present during difficult conversations, and Rebecca learned to recognize the difference between emotional avoidance and emotional overwhelm. The most significant shift occurred when they developed a signal system that allowed Marcus to communicate when he was feeling overwhelmed without completely shutting down the conversation. Instead of pretending problems didn't exist, he learned to say, "This feels too big right now, but can we come back to it tomorrow?" This simple acknowledgement that a problem existed, even if he couldn't address it immediately, created space for both of their emotional needs. Their story demonstrates how the ostrich effect operates not from a place of cruelty or indifference, but from deep vulnerability and fear. Understanding this distinction becomes crucial when learning to address these patterns, whether they're appearing in a romantic relationship, friendship, or family dynamic. Now that the psychological landscape has been mapped through Rebecca and Marcus's experience, the focus shifts to practical strategies that can help navigate these challenging dynamics with wisdom and compassion. The first essential step involves learning to recognize the ostrich effect in action, because these patterns often disguise themselves as reasonable behavior. Pay attention to conversations that seem to end abruptly when emotional topics arise. Notice when someone consistently changes the subject away from relationship concerns or personal feelings. Watch for the phenomenon where serious discussions about the relationship get postponed indefinitely, always delayed by seemingly urgent but ultimately less important matters. One particularly revealing sign is the "everything is fine" declaration that feels disconnected from observable reality. When someone insists that nothing is wrong while their behavior suggests otherwise, this often indicates that their psychological defense system has kicked into high gear. Think about Joe Goldberg from the Netflix series You. While his character takes avoidance to dangerous extremes, his tendency to rationalize away obvious problems and convince himself that his clearly unhealthy behaviors are actually expressions of love demonstrates how the mind can create elaborate stories to avoid facing uncomfortable truths. Understanding the underlying fear that drives this behavior becomes crucial for responding effectively. Remember that the ostrich effect serves a protective function, even when that protection has become counterproductive. Approaching someone who employs these strategies with criticism or demands for immediate emotional openness often triggers even stronger avoidance responses. Instead, create safety through consistency and patience. When dealing with someone who tends to avoid relationship problems, timing becomes everything. Choose moments when they're relaxed and not feeling pressured or defensive. Begin conversations with reassurance rather than criticism. Instead of saying, "You always shut down when we need to talk," try, "I care about our relationship and want to understand how to communicate better with you." This approach reduces the likelihood that their defense system will interpret the conversation as a threat requiring immediate avoidance. Here's a crucial insight that many people miss. Avoidant individuals often communicate their feelings through actions rather than words. Learning to recognize this alternative emotional language can provide valuable information about their internal experience. When someone can't verbally acknowledge relationship problems but starts working extra hours, cleaning obsessively, or throwing themselves into projects, they might be expressing anxiety about the relationship in the only way that feels safe to them. Developing patience for this indirect form of communication doesn't mean accepting indefinite avoidance of important conversations. Instead, it means understanding that building trust and safety might be necessary before more direct emotional communication becomes possible. Set gentle boundaries around timeline expectations while acknowledging their different communication style. Consider the character Blair Waldorf from Gossip Girl, who often expressed her deepest fears and insecurities through elaborate schemes and dramatic actions rather than direct conversation. While her methods were certainly more theatrical than most people's avoidance strategies, the underlying pattern remains similar. When direct emotional expression feels too risky, people find alternative ways to communicate their internal experience. Creating what relationship experts call emotional safety requires specific, intentional actions. This means proving through consistency that emotional conversations don't lead to abandonment, criticism, or overwhelming drama. When someone with avoidant tendencies does manage to share something vulnerable, respond with appreciation for their courage rather than immediately diving deeper into emotional territory. Thank them for trusting you with their feelings before asking follow-up questions or sharing your own emotional responses. Establish regular, low-pressure opportunities for connection that don't revolve around problem-solving or heavy emotional processing. This might look like taking walks together, cooking meals, or engaging in shared activities that create natural opportunities for conversation without the formal pressure of "we need to talk" moments. These casual interactions often provide openings for more significant discussions to develop organically. One of the most powerful tools for addressing the ostrich effect involves helping the avoidant person recognize the connection between their avoidance strategies and their relationship fears. This requires tremendous patience and skill because pointing out defense mechanisms too directly often strengthens them. Instead of saying, "You're avoiding this conversation," try, "I notice we've started talking about weekend plans every time I bring up how we're doing as a couple. I'm wondering if relationship conversations feel overwhelming somehow." Learning to validate the feelings behind avoidance strategies while still addressing the impact on the relationship creates space for growth without triggering additional defensiveness. Acknowledge that emotional conversations can feel scary or uncomfortable while still expressing your needs for connection and communication. This balanced approach helps the avoidant person feel understood rather than criticized for their natural protective instincts. Here's where things get particularly nuanced. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is recognize when someone's avoidance patterns are too entrenched for the relationship to be healthy for either person. Setting boundaries around your own emotional needs doesn't mean lacking compassion for their struggles. You can understand why someone employs the ostrich effect while still choosing not to accept indefinite emotional distance in your relationship. Practice what therapists call curious inquiry rather than confrontational questioning. Instead of demanding explanations for avoidant behavior, express genuine curiosity about their internal experience. Ask questions like, "What would make it easier for you to talk about difficult things?" Or, "How can I bring up concerns in a way that doesn't feel overwhelming?" These questions invite collaboration rather than defensiveness. Remember that change happens gradually, with plenty of setbacks along the way. Celebrate small victories, like when someone acknowledges that a problem exists, even if they're not ready to discuss solutions yet. Recognize progress when someone manages to stay present during an emotional conversation for longer than usual, even if they still struggle to fully engage. Most importantly, develop your own support system for navigating these challenging dynamics. Whether you're trying to address avoidant patterns in yourself or someone you care about, having external perspectives and emotional support makes the process much more sustainable. Consider speaking with friends, family members, or professional counselors who can provide guidance and encouragement during difficult periods. The journey of understanding and addressing the ostrich effect reveals fundamental truths about human nature and the complex ways we protect ourselves from emotional pain. Like Emily Cooper from Emily in Paris, who often avoided confronting the messy realities of her romantic situations by throwing herself into work projects and maintaining relentless optimism, many people develop sophisticated strategies for sidestepping emotional discomfort. The difference lies in recognizing when these strategies serve us and when they begin to limit our capacity for genuine connection and growth. Working with avoidance patterns, whether in ourselves or others, requires the kind of patient, persistent love that refuses to give up on someone's capacity for growth while still honoring our own emotional needs. This balance between compassion and boundaries creates the conditions where real change becomes possible, though never easy or quick. The most profound insight emerging from this exploration is that the ostrich effect ultimately represents a tragedy of missed connection. Every time someone buries their head in the sand to avoid relationship problems, they also miss opportunities for deeper intimacy, understanding, and love. The very thing they're trying to protect, their relationships, suffers from the protection itself. Yet there's remarkable hope in understanding these patterns, because awareness creates choice. When someone begins to recognize their own avoidance strategies, they gain the power to make different decisions. When partners learn to respond to avoidance with curiosity and patience, rather than criticism and demands, they create space for walls to come down gradually and safely. The work of addressing the ostrich effect requires courage from everyone involved. For the avoidant person, it means risking the very emotional exposure they've spent years learning to prevent. For their partners, it means learning to love someone who struggles to receive and express love in conventional ways. For both people, it means choosing growth over comfort, connection over safety, and hope over fear. This choice isn't made once, but repeatedly, in small moments and daily decisions. It's choosing to stay present during a difficult conversation instead of checking your phone. It's choosing to ask gentle questions instead of making accusations. It's choosing to believe in someone's capacity for growth even when their behavior suggests otherwise. Remember that every person employing the ostrich effect learned these strategies for good reasons. Their younger selves developed these protective mechanisms because they were necessary for emotional or even physical survival. Approaching these patterns with compassion and understanding honors the wisdom of their younger selves while creating space for their adult selves to make different choices. The ultimate goal isn't to eliminate all avoidance or to force anyone into levels of emotional expression that feel unsafe to them. Instead, the goal is expanding choices and creating relationships where both people can feel seen, understood, and valued for who they truly are. This means accepting that some people will always be more comfortable expressing love through actions rather than words, while still ensuring that both partners' emotional needs are acknowledged and addressed. As you move forward from this understanding, carry with you the knowledge that change is possible but never guaranteed, that patience and consistency create more transformation than pressure and ultimatums, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is believe in someone's capacity for growth even when they don't believe in it themselves. The ostrich effect doesn't have to be a permanent life sentence. It can become a starting point for deeper understanding and more authentic connection. Whether you recognize these patterns in yourself or someone you love, remember that seeking help and support is a sign of wisdom, not weakness. Professional counselors, trusted friends, and educational resources can provide invaluable guidance for navigating these complex emotional territories. The journey toward healthier relationships requires courage, but you don't have to walk that path alone.
Thank you for watching. If you want to learn how to better understand avoidance, relationships, and psychological biases, then subscribe to our channel, because you deserve beautiful relationships.